In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England, and as the story goes, after that point, French became the predominant language in the English court, up until about the reign of Henry V. We call William William, right? And in French historiography, he's called Guillaume le Conquérant, or perhaps Guillaume le Bâtard, because his parents were not married. Now, if we want to be sticklers for perhaps some form of historical authenticity, maybe we should start calling him Guillaume, right? I mean, he was French, he was a Norman duke, but not so fast. If we look at the Bayeux tapestry, his name is actually written like this, Wilhelm, and we can only assume that that pretty much reflects how he and those around him would have pronounced it. The goal, of course, with the Bayeux tapestry is to ostensibly transcribe everything in Latin, but it's questionable how consistent that was applied at the time. Now, even if perhaps you're not convinced by the Bayeux tapestry as a form of evidence here, I want to talk about something parallel here. Notice that he is William in English, but Guillaume in French. He's Guillermo in Spanish, like the famous director Guillermo del Toro. There's Guglielmo, like Guglielmo Marconi in Italian, and Guilherme in Portuguese, and Guillem in Catalan. I'd be interested to hear what it is in Romanian. My assumption is that Romanian might follow the more Slavic route of pronunciation, but you could perhaps correct me there. But you might be asking, so what? All that we've spoken about so far is how William begins with a W in English, but with a G in the Romance languages. Then I'd like to point you to this country directly to the west of England. We call it Wales in English, but cast your mind over the Romance languages. What's it called in all of those languages? Now, you might be latching onto something here, and that's exactly what we want to discuss in this episode. One of the neat things about Proto-Indo-European is that there exist these really useful distinguishing features that mark out isoglosses. For example, one of the major distinctions in early Proto-Indo-European is between the Kentum languages towards the west and the Satem languages towards the east. Or the Kentum languages would pronounce their word for 100 with the velar consonant k, whereas to the east, the word for 100 would be pronounced with the sibilant s. Now, obviously, in the modern Romance languages, for example, that velar consonant has become assimilated, but the general rule does hold. Another interesting one between the Germanic languages and the Romance languages is the so-called p-f distinction that was discovered by the Grimm brothers. So words in Latin that begin with the plosive p tend to begin with the labiodental fricative f in the Germanic languages. This is why you have a foot in English, but it's a piede in Italian, why it's fish in English, but pez in Spanish, and it actually applies across all the other Germanic languages as well. As a very brief side note, in Latin we have pater, which gives us padre, pai, père. But of course in English we have father. This has actually come down into Afrikaans, for example, as father, which makes me wonder if speakers of Afrikaans were at all surprised by the plot twist in The Empire Strikes Back when Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, reveals that he is the father of Luke. It was pretty much written out there, very obvious for any speaker of Afrikaans, and perhaps even of Dutch, to work out from the beginning. I'd be surprised to hear how people received it at the time, if you have any better information on that than I do. But it always struck me as something moderately humorous that for a small portion of the audience, that wouldn't have been particularly surprising. It would have been given away pretty much from the moment Darth Vader was introduced. But anyway, back to the WG distinction, because that's also another one of these markers. It doesn't quite mark out an isogloss, but it does mark out a tendency that occurs when Germanic words were adopted into the Romance languages. And to really track this properly, we need to go back to Proto-Germanic, because Proto-Germanic had an abundance of vocabulary beginning with the labiovelar approximant w. I'm not actually sure why, but we have examples of this, reconstructed examples of this, such as witras, which means knowing, related to wits, having your wits about you in modern English. Rethas, which means something like furious or cruel, which is where we get wrath from. Wistis would mean nature or maybe the essence of something. So we have tons of vocabulary in Proto-Germanic with this w sound at the beginning. And of course, we also have to keep in mind that historically, with the border of the Roman Empire lying more or less along the Rhine and the Germanic tribes being above that border, there was extensive trade, contact, and exchange of all sorts between these two blocks, the Roman and the Germanic bloc. And this only increased in time as more Germanic peoples became incorporated, Romanized, and entered into Roman institutions, notably the military at first. And words, of course, were part of these broad exchanges. So it's only natural that a good part of Germanic vocabulary started flowing into late Latin and early Romance. But we are faced with a problem with the inventory of Latin. We know that Latin had this w, this labio-velar approximant, which was represented by the what we would today call the V letter. This is why Caesar would have said something like veni vidi vici. But we do also know that it's highly likely that at very latest, by the end of the 2nd century AD, that w sound was already being fricativized. That is to say, it was actually being pronounced almost like the labiodental v. Caesar might have said veni vidi vici, but readers of the Gospel of St. John, for example, might well have read out a key passage as et verbum caro factum est. So it seems that when late Latin, early Romance speakers adopted some of this Germanic vocabulary that began with w, they started adding a velar stop before that initial vowel. That is to say, w might have started out being pronounced something like w and then eventually just pronounced g. Perhaps the most appropriate example of this, given that so much of the military administration began to be staffed by people of Germanic origin in the late Empire and early Middle Ages, the Germanic word guerra, which meant war, would in time give us Spanish guerra, Italian guerra, etc., etc. And I must admit that I am simplifying this according to two large blocks. Obviously, the way that these words were adopted did vary according to, firstly, the Germanic language that introduced them, and then the early Romance language that received them, if you pardon the slightly inaccurate linguistic terms there. But here are some general patterns. The Germanic source of French Germanic vocabulary tended to come from Frankish. In Spanish and Portuguese, the Germanic constituent tends to have been Visigothic, but not exclusively so, and in Italian from either Ostrogothic or Lombard. So that's super simple then. English is a Germanic language, and thus it kept the initial labio-velar consonant w, and the Romance languages which descended from Latin and by late antiquity no longer had that labio-velar w tended to adopt this Germanic vocabulary with the soft velar g sound. And this is why, as we've just looked at, we have guerra in Italian, but war in English. This is why in Spanish to keep something is guardar, but in English you could be the ward of something that you wanted to protect. But this doesn't actually really answer everything. Firstly, we've just spoken about how William the Conqueror was French and his court spoke French. So why does it seem that he refers to himself as Wilhelm? And even if that is a little bit of an historical stretch, why does English also seem to inherit all of these couplets? Why do we have ward and guard, for example, which both come from the Proto-Germanic wardana? Now, the first question there might be the slightly easier answer. If William the Conqueror actually did refer to himself as Wilhelm and his court referred to him as Wilhelm, well, that can be relatively easily explained by the fact that he didn't speak French in the strict sense that we might refer to it today. He spoke Norman French, which was a kind of French that was heavily influenced by Germanic, because, of course, the Normans, as the name indicates, were actually initially Norse. And so even though over time they came to adopt French in customs and language almost in entirety, there were still vestiges of the Old Norse past, both linguistic and cultural, that remained up until William's time. So if he called himself Wilhelm, we could probably attribute it to that. But the second, more interesting question about all these English couplets is a tad more complex, but worth exploring nonetheless. The reason is actually still what we began the video with, the Norman Conquest. Yes, though with certain Norse vestiges, William and his court still spoke French. And so a lot of the words that they introduced to the English language that were of Germanic origin took the French forms of those words. And so we have a situation where the population speaking Old English had all of these naturally evolved initial w forms. Wer meant man, for example. It's actually where we get werewolf from. It literally means man, wolf. But the French speakers who were now part of the court and established the norms for the prestigious dialect of the Kingdom of England, they were pronouncing these Germanic initial w words with the velar consonant g instead. Eventually, those filtered down into the English language as a whole. This is why we have both a guarantee and a warranty in English. This is why we can both reward and regard something highly. I hope that was interesting. Do you have any fascinating examples of the split between Romance adoption of Germanic words and the way that they're pronounced today in Germanic languages? I'm sure that actually this is an abundant thing. I've probably left out quite a few good examples. But if you want to look at a few more examples, in doing research for this video, I came across this really nice map by Starkey Comics. I'm going to try leave a link in the description so that you can access those maps yourself. And then also I want to point you towards the History of the English Language podcast by Kevin Stroud if you're interested in going to a little bit more depth on this, because it is a fascinating topic. I'm going to thank you for watching this video today. I hope to see you in the next one. And until then, take care.